So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is mostly about data portraits, looking at ways of visualizing large amounts of data about people. But what I'm particularly interested in is framing it in a larger series of related metaphors about the idea of the body as being made of data in the online space. Actually, one quick question, just so I know. What's our timing here? How much should I be
You've got about an hour and 10 minutes to do whatever you want, and then we'll break for cake.
Okay, so I will not going to speak for an hour and 10 minutes. For those of you waiting for cake, but I'd like to have some time for questions too. And please feel free to interrupt at any point if you have questions, disagreement, whatever. So to start with this quote, "I am my body to the extent that I am," by Sartre, which is somewhat of a play on Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." But it's one of the things we take for granted in our face-to-face interactions is we really think of the notion that identity is one person, one body. So even though here in the 21st century, there's a lot of different issues around what really is one's identity, or do you have different identities in different contexts, very much in the physical world, we have this notion that your identity is pretty firmly rooted in your body, that there is one of you. And one of the other things it gives us, for better or for worse, is that the body is the center of social control. This can be at the very coercive level. If you're really bad, you are in jail, and your body is not really going anywhere. To the extent that you get in trouble, it's usually some kind of physical confinement. You're put into handcuffs, you're put into jail, you're sent to your room if you're a child. But even at a very small level, we sort of constantly deal with this notion of boundaries and places where we can go and where we can't go, and they're all very much defined around the body. Then we come to the online world. How many of you are familiar with 4chan? So, a few, not many. So it's our contemporary example, but this has been going on since the beginning of online interactions, is that online it's very, very easy to continuously recreate new identities. Julian Dibble wrote a story in the Village Voice in the early 1990s, I think, called "A Rape in Cyberspace," which was sort of one of the earliest publications about, this took place in a mud of someone who came in and was really, really bothering people and could be thrown off the mud and then reappear continuously under a new name, a new login. So even though at some level there's a singular physical person, in terms of your online experience, identity can be very, very fluid. And to the extent that these identities are anonymous and multiple, there's quite a lack of social control. It's very hard, it's very easy for, how many of you have had your email hijacked? Or you've certainly, for those of you who haven't had that experience, you've certainly received mail that purported to be from a friend, but was actually someone pretending to be that identity. So a lot of the things we take for granted about identity and control are very, very different online. One of the things though that we, but one of the things we do have online is we have tremendous amounts of data. And to the extent, if you're in a long-term community online, you realize that these notions about identity being very fluid become very different. For instance, once you are interested in having some kind of reputation, this is not the main point of my work, but it's one of those little points that I want to keep clear with people, because I think the word reputation is very badly used online. It's not really that you have a reputation online, it's that you have a history. And those are two very, very different things. And I think the word reputation is often misused. So I just want to take a minute to discuss that. Is that reputation is really what other people think of you. You can have a good reputation, a bad reputation. Most of what's called reputation online is really a history of your actions. And both of these things are valuable. In some ways, your history of interactions is a little bit more of an objective sense. Reputation has a lot of very difficult things because the people's reasons for saying good things or bad things about you may have as much to do with themselves, their relationship with others, as it has to do with your quality. So there's a lot of very interesting but problematic aspects to reputation. So online, what anchors identity to some extent is reputation, but to a large extent it's history. If you have built up a history of behaving in a particular way, being very funny, being very helpful, being very supportive in a particular community, you've invested a great deal of time and effort into having some kind of persona or reputation there, and so that becomes of value to you, and in that sense, your history functions as that body online. So what you see in places where people really do care about what others think of them, of having that particular role, you don't have the same identity issues that you have in places where identity is very, very fluid. But the reason I find this idea of thinking of it in the metaphor of the body interesting is that bodies are very, very problematic in different ways. And so as we sort of look through this idea of how we visualize this data, because one of the things about bodies is we can see them, we can recognize people. We don't really have a good way of taking all this massive information about us and recognizing people through the patterns in them. So one of the things I'm interested in doing with the data portraits is thinking about how can we visualize it so that, for instance, if you enter a new community, it's much easier to start to make sense of people's roles, who they are, what their history is, etc. So that it becomes, so that your own history becomes more valuable in that sense, that people can see the patterns of how you've behaved. But the other side of it is that bodies are also really the locus of a lot of our issues, not only around control, but around privacy. And certainly these massive amounts of data have tremendous privacy issues. What I'm interested in with this metaphor is it really helps us look at some of the nuances, because we don't entirely hide bodies, but we don't entirely reveal everything about them. We deal with them differently in different contexts. And there's a lot of pieces of how we use that metaphor that I think can help us think more deeply about how we want to think about how we're going to represent, shape, present our data. And so for the next maybe 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about portraits, and some of this is going to be art history, some of it I just think is a really interesting way of thinking about it. But it also, I think, gives us a ability to, there's not a ton of work being done yet in data portraiture of having a framework for understanding some of the different approaches we could be taking to how we look at people in terms of data. So one of the first things that's obvious is that when I say there's a big difference between a portrait based on your data, and I'll discuss the piece on the right later on, it's one of the portraits I'll be talking about, and the piece on the left, which most people would recognize as a portrait. Now, almost always, and even if you look at definitions, most of what people think about in terms of portraits is something showing your face. And if you look at, you know, a pile of grocery receipts and things like that, you think, well, that's not really a portrait. You know, I don't really get a sense of someone. But one of the things I want to argue here tonight is that potentially the data that you generate, if it is rendered in an interesting enough way, is arguably a better portrait of you than something that reflects represents how light reflects off of your face. You know, we particularly tend to read a lot into faces that isn't necessarily there. I'm not going to go into this in depth tonight, but one of the other things that's quite interesting is how much we read into faces, for instance, based on their structure. There's actually a woman here at Brandeis, Leslie Zebrowitz, who does amazing work looking at the misapprehensions that people have about faces. She's done a lot of work, for instance, with the notion of baby faces, where, you know, someone is, you may be 50 years old, but if you have a turned-up nose and a high forehead and a small chin, you have many of the facial qualities that people associate with babies. And she's looked at how systematically people really start to ascribe the characteristics of naivete, innocence, etc., on someone who has that bone structure, and the opposite on people who happen to have much heavier brows and lower foreheads and bigger chins, which doesn't correlate to their personality, but it correlates a lot to what people think of them. So there's a lot of reasons to think that the face is perhaps not that great a representation of you. So one of the things I hope you come out with tonight is a sense of really what is it that a well-formed portrait of the data could say about you. Hello? Okay, so the other thing I wanted to run through a very quick history of portraiture, just to have a sense of how differently what it means to represent a person in medieval times, and how much it also represents the culture around it. So it's a very quick breeze through art history. But in medieval times, you know, in a sort of just a quick overview of it, one of the characteristics of the era is that your physical day-to-day life was not of great importance. There was a much greater weight given to the spiritual realm, much less about sort of the physical everyday world. And so one of the things that's interesting about a lot of the portraits that are done in medieval times is that they're believed not to be actually a representation of what, particularly when they're rulers, of what that ruler looked like at all. But instead they are, for instance, representations of a well-known Roman emperor whose character that ruler either aspired to or was believed to have. So they were really meant to be portraits of sort of where you sat in history and what your character was, and they weren't really meant to be a representation of what that person's face was like. As we move into the Renaissance and sort of much greater attention to the world around us, this is sort of a flourishing of portraiture and of science and of the whole notion that we can really learn from observing the world around us. This is the great age of portraiture. And here, we see much more attention being paid to what does this person look like? How can we really render the world? What are the techniques for really being able to represent what you see from a given viewpoint? One of the great pieces of discovery in the world of Renaissance painting is perspective, which is certainly something we take for granted now. But the idea of saying that when you make a painting, you are going to show what one single viewpoint would see of that space was a historical first. Because if you look at much earlier works, they're much more about telling a story. They're not about saying, I'm standing here and looking at you. So it also represents a very, very different piece of the artist in it. Because it's not about saying, this is a omniscient view, but it's saying, I was here, and I was looking at this, and you are seeing through my eyes what I see of the world. And this is going to come back again, because one of the other reasons we want to think about what we do with data in terms of portraiture is that there tends to be in the world of visualization. And, I know most of you are not in the realm of portraits at all, but I think for a lot of you, issues of data and data representation are a big thing. And so if you come away with any one notion from this talk tonight, it's the notion of what is the role of the artist. Even if you're not thinking of the product as a work of art, what is the role of the artist and their perspective in what they make? Because every single time you make a visualization, there's nothing, it cannot be a neutral representation. You pick what your axes are. You pick what colors you use. Like it or not, colors do tend to have some cultural, emotional resonance to them. You pick the axis. So if you say, how much oil is left in the world over time, you may have an axis going down that will tell a different story than if you take that data and change it so the axis is going up. Most data, just depending on how you phrase the question of what you're showing, you can show something going up or going down. In terms of what the numbers read as, they're equivalent. In terms of how people respond to it, we tend to think of things going up as good. So just by making your graph in the shape of something going up, you're giving it a little bit of a push towards the viewer thinking, oh, whatever I'm seeing is a good thing, etc. So that's sort of the biggest point that for whatever work you're doing in CHI, I think in the sort of human interface realm is that realization that any interface has an artistic viewpoint is a very important one. So this one I just wanted to talk again. Does everyone recognize what this is? Okay, so this is, so it's Anne of Cleves, right? Okay, so one person recognized that, but so what's really interesting about this is a portrait because, again, in terms of thinking about how data portraits are used, and there's a little bit of a warning story behind it, because one of the things I think, again, what I've sort of proposed, and we might want to use these portraits as how you're seen in an online space, et cetera, as something that represents you. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that we forget we live in an era of, photographs are everywhere. It's very easy to sort of see what someone looks like, see multiple views of them, etc. And it's also very easy to fly places. If you really want, we fly to meetings all the time, etc. So we forget that until the advent of photography and easy travel, people relied on portraits to know what somebody looked like. And so when Henry VIII was out looking for his fourth queen, he sent Hans Holbein, the great portrait artist, to go around and paint beautiful ladies of Europe. And one of the paintings that he made was of the two daughters of the Duke of Cleves. And this one, Anne of Cleves, for reasons both political and because the painting pleased him, he took as his wife, and he vowed to all of the sort of political alliances based around this before he had met her, completely on the basis of this painting. When he met her, he apparently was just completely appalled. He said that she looked like a fat Flanders mare, and eventually the marriage was annulled for never being consummated, but he really could not stand her. And so this is just one of these, it's just a great warning painting about, you know, what it means to get to know somebody through their portrait. So that was a good one to put in. Now we're moving along to the 20th century. And so here we have photography, which has certainly changed the notion of portraiture. It's made it very, very easy to capture, at least externally, what someone looks like. And so by the middle of the century, you know, these are just random snapshots, some I found on the web, some were mine, but you know, it just became very easy to say we can take this picture of, you know, what's really there. They might not be great portraits, they might not be very telling, but it certainly was there. You know that it, you know, assuming these were not photoshopped, that these were, you know, reflections of some external reality, but they also give people this immediate sense that there's a big difference between capturing some important meaning about what something looks like and what, you know, a flash and some, you know, photographic medium capture at that particular time. And so what happened, for a number of reasons, there was abstraction in many, many different fields, not all of which can be blamed on photography, but certainly in the realm of art, you see a lot more abstracted work. And so this is Picasso, this is a painting of one of his art dealer at the time. So this was painted as a portrait, so it's clearly not very photographic at all. But it's also, you know, the 20th century saw the rise of psychology. Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams right at the turn of the century. And so the question of saying, you know, do we want to be painting the surface of the face or some internal essence of them? The other thing that you see a lot here too is that if you look at this, you're not immediately thinking this is a portrait, but you probably are immediately thinking this is a Picasso. And so a lot of what you recognize here is this change in the importance of what are you looking at when you look at some of these paintings. Is what's interesting the subject, or is what's interesting the rendering of it and what the person painted it?
In one of the earlier paintings that you showed, there was a guy working in his studio, his library, where he had compasses and he had some kind of geometric things and stuff with it. You were talking about photography. I'm not sure that the sort of snapshots you showed, I don't know what the Picasso is, but in the case of the snapshots, I'm not sure that those would be characterized as portraits. But I do a lot of photography, and I'm very familiar with the history of photography. Certainly, photographic portraiture, the concept of the so-called environmental portrait, where you show the person in a context with their tools and tools,
right.
is a very standard way of doing portraiture, at least among photographers who are sort of self-consciously doing what they would call portraiture. And that was also, as you illustrated here, a practice in Renaissance portrait painting. So I think that tradition has maintained a certain continuity, and it recognizes that we are not just our physical appearance, our face and so forth, but also the things that surround us, the activities that we do. And you see this even in Facebook, where people put not only a rendering of themselves, but my hobbies are, my interests, that kind of thing. So I think there is this concept even in portraiture of more than just the person, but his stuff, his activities.
Right. Yeah, and I think I agree. And so part of it is also giving a fairly linear story, but certainly when you see, particularly in the Renaissance, to understand a lot of portraits, you really need to effectively look at the data that's around them. And you could remove the person, and there still is what is effectively a data portrait. That's sort of some of their possessions and what they did, and there's often writings that represent them in some way, and so all kinds of information about them and who they are.
I also think, though, that the definition of portraiture is relative to the recipient. So to those snapshots that were given, if you're giving that to someone who wants to remember you, that recipient is going to react to that as oh, that's a portrait, or that's a picture. So I think,
I don't know if they would use the word portrait, but I think portrait is a term that gets used in a particular way. It's a picture of you, but I think when you throw in the word portrait, there's an implication of something a little more.
Right. I wasn't trying to say those were or were not or that a snapshot can't be a portrait, but it was more, the point that I was trying to make with those more was that we're now in an era where being able to make a visual representation of external reality is cheap and easy, and anybody can do it.
Yeah.
So it's no longer, you know, in a particularly exalted realm, and that it has then meant that it's one of the forces that has meant that other forms of representation start thinking beyond just what do things look like, because photography has taken that over. Not entirely, there certainly moves back and forth between representation, but that ability to quickly capture visual reality is very easy now. So.
But hasn't the definition of, portraiture has been established in a lot of ways to remember. To, you have something and you hire a oil painter way back when, because you didn't have the means to document yourself. So, but it was always in some cases a means of extending your life or extending yourself past a certain point in time, or giving yourself to someone else.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I mean, all of those pieces, right, so that's still in the notion of that one of the roles of a portrait is to represent the person. You know, it might be with, whether it's Anne of Cleves or you in a news group, in an online discussion, that it's effectively a stand-in for that person. So there are all kinds of functions beyond just being decorative.
Do we know who this Picasso is a portrait of?
It is a portrait of his German art dealer, whose name I forget, but yes, I mean, the title of it is...
Kahnweiler.
Yes, thank you, Henry Kahnweiler. Thank you. I just forgot. But, yes, so that's who it is of. And, you can see a bit of a face in it. I think part of the point here is that to understand how it functions as a portrait, you need to look at it in the context of his other work. Some of it is, you take on faith, but a lot of it is much more about a question of what is behind the mind of the artist than of the represented person. It's certainly not it's not a painting that's about what he looks like at all. So, getting back to data and the idea of the data portrait, we're surrounded by it. And so what I want to talk about now is some experiments, some that my students and I did, some that were done elsewhere, of thinking about how you can take some data from some places and make something portrait-like. Oh, and this actually gets back to the point about things around. One of the other things is there's been a variety of different works that do address trying to make portraits that aren't digital pieces, that are just about stuff. Rachel Strickland did this when she was at Interval, and it was a series of, it was meant to be portraits where they had a machine, this was in the mid-90s, where you would go in and dump out the contents of your handbag or your backpack or anything else. And the idea was to make portraits of people based on the things that they carried around with them. Peter Menzel, the photographer, has done a book called Material World, where he sent a group of photographers around the world. They picked different, what they called statistically average households from different communities around the world, and had them empty their houses of every single thing in them, and they photographed the families amidst all their possessions in front of their houses. And these read very much as portraits. The French artist Christian Boltanski has done a series of portraits that are based on looking at inventories of people's possessions. So certainly the idea of the things that you have around you without the person in it as a form of portraiture has a certain resonance right now. The other big piece of data that certainly has increasing resonance now is the idea of genetic portraits. So this is called a genetic portrait of Isabel Goldsmith. And what I think are fascinating about these, there's a number of different people who've done them, and now there's a company, something called Data 13 or Data 11, where I guess they send you a little cup to spit in, and they will give you, for like $2,000, you get a big wall-sized genetic portrait. And the website is really funny because I think they really want to, it looks very much like corporate art. They really want it to be corporate art. So you can sort of imagine like coming into work, there's like the boss's DNA. And just like move the DNA portraits in and out depending on who's in power. And you can do double portraits of the DNA. So they're kind of cool looking. But very fascinating about these is that in terms of information, this really is the essence of who you are specifically. And it's the least evocative portrait ever to look at, because it's really, really meaningless to us as a viewer. It says virtually nothing. You can look at room after room full of these, and you are not going to think anything about these people. There's zero information in terms of evocativeness in them. I mean, to the extent that someone like this, where they're painting them, might choose to do something where they start with that data and then they're making something that may be more evocative because of even other things that they know. But I think it's also a very interesting piece to show how the fact that some data may, at some level, be extremely relevant about you does not necessarily mean it's evocative. So part of the problem is how do you pick what is truly evocative to a human viewer information. So I know Fernando was here speaking about more recent work a couple of weeks ago, but this was done by Fernando Villegas and Mark Smith, and Fernando was a student of mine at the time. So this is, and the next three pieces I'm going to show you all deal with trying to do portraits based on people's actions in news groups or other online discussions. And what they did here was they were looking at, how do people act in news groups? And the data is actually quite simple. What they did is each dot represents someone's participation in a conversation. So the bigger the dot is, the more they participated in a particular thread within a news group. And it's a histogram, so each column represents a week of postings. The orangey ones on top of the horizontal line are replies, and the ones on the bottom are initial postings, or vice versa. I don't remember which one. One is replies, one is initial postings. And so what you get here is something where if you look at one of these, you can read it a little bit. You don't really get that much sense of how evocative it is. But if you start looking at numerous ones of them, you really start to get a sense of how to read this, because you can, like for instance, you can instantly see someone who's probably a spammer or has spammer-like characteristics is that it's lots and lots of little dots all below the line, because they're sending out initial postings, they're not responding to anybody, they're not getting into a conversation, it's just lots of like, I'll send something out, when we send something out, it's not part of the conversation. You can start seeing people who are, what they call the answerers, who are in a news group and they're kind of there as an expert and they answer questions. They very seldom actually start any discussion, but they respond to things. And they may respond once or twice, so they don't get into deep discussions, but they're there and they're very responsive. You can see the people who get into huge arguments because they have these enormous bubbles, because they're probably like going back and forth with someone else, for 30 hours about something. And so it's a very sort of dry statistical look. It's really meant to be as neutral as possible. When you look at it, you cannot, if I just show this in a room, I said, what is this? You don't know, you have no idea what it is. But you certainly it becomes very, very readable once you understand what sense it makes, and it takes this very neutral, this neutral as possible pose, because it does not know what they are talking about. So it's meant to be a super neutral visual, because it can be on any topic whatsoever. This I just want to show you because there's two things. Somebody, and again I have it in my notes, but I'm not going to escape out of it. It was did a version of this. They're really interested in it. It was Mark Smith and someone else. Did another version without Fernando, who's a really amazing graphic artist. And so one thing is that it really shows that if you just add a little bit too much sort of like Tufty calls charge on, it becomes really, really ugly. So it's not as beautiful as Fernando's anymore. I think the bubbles aren't. But here you see this example of, here they did some and they show you like the different types of speakers and how you really can start to read personality based on how they use the different bubbles here. And so you can see if you went through a new, if you go into a new discussion group or a new community and you start to see charts like this, it really can give you the sense very, very quickly of what are the different roles that people play, or how have their roles changed over time. One of the things that can be very, very hard to keep track of in online space are things like, has so-and-so kind of just disappeared? You kind of remember a name being there, but then they're just not there anymore. So there's all kinds of patterns that you can read through things like this that are really, really useful. So the idea of thinking about how different would it feel to come into some of these discussions and just have like this ring of the participants in some kind of data representation like this. This takes similar material. This was done, this is actually an earlier piece. The ones you just saw were done around 2002. This is from 1999. This is another student of mine, Rebecca Zion, who was looking at the same problem. She did it with flowers. And I think there's some, I mean, it's an interesting way, the data is very, very similar again. Here, the different colors of the petals have to do with its replies or not. The height of the flower is how long you've been in the group, and the number of petals shows how many postings you've had within a particular time. They fade over time. Some more recent ones are brighter, the faded ones are older. And I think it's a very interesting and problematic one, because the first thing about it is you start to see that use of height is really intuitive, for length of time. We really do think of things growing up. What's kind of nice about it is, this was meant to also give you a whole news group at a time, so you could look at it quickly. This was sort of in the fading days of Usenet, when there were still some lively groups around, but a lot of it had just turned into spam. And so the idea here was it was almost like a thumbprint that you could look at of a particular group and see, is this really desolate? What was kind of nice about it was those groups that really weren't working very much anymore, nothing was really functioning, you would go in and they would look really desolate. We'd just see like these long stalks of things, but there was nothing on the tip because no one had been there for a long time. And you could see the ones that were still thriving, and it's the metaphor of the garden and the flower is really intuitive. So that part is good. But the problem is the metaphor kind of overwhelms what is going on here. It's because what happens is, for instance, especially for anyone who's spent any time on Usenet in the 1990s, it seemed like 50% of it was neo-Nazi hate groups, but they really don't benefit from being, it's not good for the flower garden metaphor, it's not good for them, it's just not very suitable in any direction. So what happens when you have something like this garden metaphor, it has so many of its own meanings that overwhelm what you're saying, that unless you're trying, unless you say, well, the metaphor really suits it, and this is, the ladies quilting group, and they really like these flowers, it's not very appropriate. So, but one of the pieces I think we can learn from this is that there's a lot of the metaphor within it can be done without it being so literally a flower. So the notion, so for instance, if you do things with something that reads a little bit like a stalk, but it's not a flower, you can do things with saying, I want something that starts to have greater and greater amounts of detail, the more material that it is. And it's sort of duller when there's nothing there. I want to use growth, which is fairly intuitive. So I think there's ways that you can abstract from this kind of heavy-handed metaphor to something that would still work very well as a sort of portrait without overwhelming you with that. This is another one that, at the time, I really didn't like, and I've grown to like a lot better. For a student long ago graduated, and I was like, this is okay. But I should tell me, I haven't thought about it. 10 years have passed, and it's looking a little better. So here was someone who was trying to deal with the fact that the problem of the use of statistical graphs to represent a person. The thing with Fernandez's work, the author lines, is that it reads very well, it's very, very neutral. But on the other hand, if you're saying, this is a picture of my community, at some point, there is something nice about these clean statistical graphs, but at some point, it's also a little cold, where everything, a lot of times, for instance, one of the things that bothers me, I spend a lot of time looking at what people are doing in visualizations. And if you look on sites like Network Visual Complexity, they're great, but you look at, a social network, or a disease network, or a network, every single kind of, it can be weapons networks, lots and lots of things are networks, but the maps of all of them look exactly the same. So how do you start to play with the idea that this is a social thing, and it's meant to represent a person, and it's meant to be the setting for your social interactions? How can we get away from that sort of chilliness of the purely abstract? So what Anthropomorphs was trying to do, how many of you are familiar with Chernoff faces? So Chernoff, for those who aren't, Chernoff faces are, I think, more problematic than this. So Chernoff face is the attempt there was to use our ability to recognize faces to do statistical graphs. And so the turnouts thought, well, people are really good at recognizing other people, so what I can do is I can make a mouth, and I can take all these different multi-dimensional things, like make the eyes bigger, smaller, further apart, and everything. And what people would be able to do is, it's not so much that you'd be able to recognize them, but you'd be able to recognize similar ones very, very quickly. And so they're a little bit good at similarity, but they're problematic in other ways because it's not a linear function. You can start moving things around, and it makes a huge difference, and then moving some other feature around, the same amount doesn't matter. So it doesn't take into any account the psychology of human faces, but it's sort of the predecessor of thinking about the face or the body as the medium for visualizing data. So what Ethan did here was he put different aspects of these sort of different statistics from news groups onto bodies. And so the facial expressions are meant to represent emotion. He was doing it still problematic, but it was more problematic then, looking at were the postings mostly angry or happy or supportive, etc., and trying to do a facial expression that matched that. The squares all represent postings that that person made, so the more that you post, the bigger you are. So that was one of the first problems he ran into, was that it's one thing to say, well, I want my graphs going up. I have spoken more. My flower is bigger and much lusher than yours. So when you have more in a flower, it looks lush. When you have more in a person, they just start looking really, really, really big. And because he also had the arms go up more the more they spoke. It's like, I am so big, I cannot even put my arms down, which actually wasn't really what he wanted to look like.
Are those supposed to be independent, Barry? In other words, do the arms have to mean one thing and the volume of the body means something else?
In that case, I think those were actually the same data.
I see.
In that case, and I'm not sure, I cannot now remember why he did both, or if there was a good reason for it. And then, I think it was more just so that you could get this piece at a glance, and so other things could be relative to other things. How wide apart the legs are how central that person is to the group. And so what his measurement of that had to do with how the percentage of things they wrote that were replied to, and how much stuff they replied. So basically, how much did they get involved in conversations? And the more involved in conversations they were, the wider apart their legs are. And then, so one of the things that also happens there, the problem with doing anything on a human body like this, first of all, you have this if I'm bigger, it's not necessarily better, but you also, for instance, you get gender out of it. Like, it's very hard to not read these as gendered. You see this big body like this with its legs apart like that. Get on the subway, you don't see a lot of women sitting on 3 subway seats with their legs right apart, but there are a lot more men who will sit like that. Like, I have all this room here. And so part of it was, if you're doing this as a thing that represents you, because now it's this person and it becomes you in a very different way, the fact that it then goes off and has its own appearance becomes something that maybe is fun to look at in other people, but can be very uncomfortable for the person themselves. And so I think it's one of these things that's it's a really interesting failure of why it doesn't work. And there's something very nice about saying you do, again, when you see a whole bunch of these and they were animated, you looked at it, it was lovely in the sense that we really felt that you were looking at a lively group. You could see, it felt like you could walk in, I could put this up here, and you'd say, what is it? What is this a visualization of? It's like, well, it's a group of people. And there's something to be said about that. But the problem of trying to put data onto bodies is a really difficult one to address. And I don't know if there's a good solution to it, but at least this is an example of seeing what sort of doesn't work, but was interesting to try.
So knowing Ethan, I'm just wondering, because he's not per se the most athletic person I know, I wonder if he had taken it, if it was someone who did the same thing to athletic body instead of doing, big this way, getting muscular or something like that. What
Yeah, and I think,
would have
I think there's a lot of things that can be done, and now that I've started looking back at this, he did another version that was much more abstract, which read less as a person, but I think it actually is a very promising one, where it was more of a, it was rectangle, sort of would just get more and more elongated, but the faces and the arms didn't express anything, but they were just much more abstract. It was just like an abstract silhouette, and it had it looked more like was it Egon Schiele? There's these manners paintings where it's just lots and lots of like gold dots and things like that, and you just get more or less of that. So I think there actually are ways to do that where I don't think it's a complete dead end. So I think it's definitely something worth pursuing more of.
Well, Tinsley Galligan did something sort of similar with this thing at the Children's Museum with fish, where kids can design a fish, and each physical characteristic of the fish correlates to a personality trait. So, the bigger the nose, the more aggressive, the bigger the eyes, the more something else. And so you can tell by looking at one of these fish how it's going to behave.
Right. So I think a lot of it also then depends on sort of, again, what's the context of your space, because, if you're, trying to have like a serious discussion and everybody is fish, I mean, it works in the Children's Museum, so I think some of it is that there's no right answer about what level of abstraction works. Part of these are just these different attempts to deal with non-human representation, human representation, abstract representation. I think it's a design space that there's a tremendous amount of work to be done in, and a lot of it is going to be context dependent about whether it's a fun space. Is a space for children? Is it a space for discussing financial disclosures? Because part of it is how serious do you want to be taken? And partly when the piece represents you, and you know that people see it as you, there's certainly the issue of what the data is saying about you, but also then, is this something you feel comfortable as a representation of you? When they're so abstract and they're, like the author lines ones, they don't read as much as being you. So they all are in the same family. There's something very appealing about the ones that are much more an individual organic form, but then they can be, when they don't work, they're very often. So it's an interesting balance, in my opinion. And I just wanted to talk a little bit, we've sort of mentioned this a little bit before, but that there's a tension between the subject and the artist and the audience. This has sort of been implied here, but I wanted to make it explicit here, which is that the subject really in general wants to appear as well as possible. You really would like you yourself or your portrait or your representation to be as positively about whatever, I mean, if you want to be, if you want to be scary and dangerous, you might be a very different notion of positive than someone who wants to appear really beautiful, but there's this, you have a particular goal of how you wish to look. The artist has a number of mixed goals. I mean, some of it is, especially if you're their patron, they would like to please you so that you're not furious with them, or, especially, depending on different relationships between artist and subject, they may be primarily just trying to make you happy, or that may be somewhat of an afterthought. They have their own artistic vision that they want to get across, which we certainly saw with something like the Picasso painting, and they have, and then they also may want, they're trying to represent some truth or something interesting that they see about you. The audience in, traditional portraiture is both trying to get a sense of who the subject is. We've all looked at sort of photography portraits or street photographs and just realize you are making up stories about the people. It's very fascinating who they are. But you also, especially if the work is an artwork, you're trying to get a sense of the artist. What is it that they're seeing? What does it mean to be seen through this person's eyes? When you look at something that's a portrait, you have chosen for whatever reason to see this person or this setting through someone else's eyes, and presumably those eyes are interesting for some reason. And which, as an audience, you're more interested in depends on the purpose. If you're in an art museum, you may well be much more interested in the artist than in the subject. If we're talking about something like a data portrait that stands in for the person, or a painting of a future queen that stands in for the person, you may be much more interested in the subject. So these all vary, but it's this tension that really makes something a portrait as opposed to just a visual, what we think of as just a visualization, though part of my argument is that all visualizations really have this in common too. We just don't think of it this way. I just wanted to sort of give you as a contrast in terms of particularly the artist and subject relationship. This is a painting of Elizabeth I from 1585, And she had tremendous control over, you know, the painters there. She was their patron, and they really, really needed to please her. No matter what they thought of her, it was probably not very good for their career, for any of their any deeply negative feelings that they had to come out in a painting. This is a painting of Queen, you know, this is an official portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. And I just think it represents a very, very interesting change, both of the role of the artist, the position of royalty in our society. It's this painting that's much more about doubt. It's much more, you know, you get a sense that it's much more about the artist's vision than the Queen's choice of what she wants, how she wants people to see her. But it's still considered, you know, it was commissioned as, it's an official commissioned portrait. So I think it's a very interesting balance, yes?
Kind of a frivolous question, but does anyone know what became of the artist that gave that misleading portrait to the king?
He, Holbein, he died like 4 years later. He had been doing a lot of royal commissions, and he never got another royal commission after that. He went home to Holland, I think to Holland, which is where he was from, and it's not really clear, did he go because he thought it was much healthier to go, or his family was there. So, but it certainly wasn't fantastic for his career as a royal painter. But, you know, his history has done very well by him. So, anyway. So I just thought those were just interesting examples. And then, we're not going to keep you from your cake much longer. I just wanted to run through this notion of mechanistic, of the machine as portrait, as artist, because that's one of the other pieces that we're really dealing with here, is that these are all, that the data portraits are not, in general, something that someone is sitting down with some data and painting of you. Though, you know, as I showed with the genetic one, it's certainly possible that someone will sit down and paint your data. But in general, what it's about is about someone creating a program that is going to generate things. This is an Andy Warhol self-portrait, but a lot of the controversy around a lot of the portraits that he did was that they were so mechanistic that, you know, he would take existing photos of people and then just had this process that turned them into sort of identical portraits. And so it's not just an issue around things that are about data, but that it's a sort of general issue in a lot of different fields today. Is sort of what is the role of the machine in seeing us? This was a piece that was done in an exhibit that I curated. This is by an artist named Julia Scher, and I just thought it was an interesting one for just thinking about sort of these roles of machines. Her work is mostly about security and surveillance, and, you know, that really gets at also the point that it's not just the machine doing the portraying, it's the machines collecting the data about it. You know, there's a lot of different directions I can take this conversation. And so a big piece of, we've been talking about data, and that's, you know, some of this is good and we can make these portraits, but a tremendous amount of this data is data that is collected about us, not necessarily that we want to have collected. It's collected by machines, and there's a sort of constant and growing amount of it. So she did this kind of take on the traditional photo booth where you go in, you know, you go into the mall and you take a strip of photos and you can play around. And the machine is the artist there, but you, as the viewer, as the subject, have a lot of control. You can play around, you can make faces and everything. So even though it's ultimately a machine, you as the subject have control. Here she did a photo booth, but when you went in and sat down, what you didn't realize is that you were surrounded by cameras. There was a camera over your head. There were cameras taking all these different unflattering photographs. I think the third one down, there's nothing much there, but it was a camera in the seat. So it was like a photograph of your butt, you know, being shown on the screen outside of you. And so what she was doing was a piece that was about our inability to control the machines that are looking at us and photographing us. That was the point of that work. This one is a little closer in the data portraits. This was done as part of a big installation my students and I did 2 years ago. And this is a piece called Personas that was a piece of it. And this one is sort of a warning on machine characterization as a way of portraying someone. And this is actually up online. If you go to personas.me, or just do a search on personas, but you can go to personas.media.mit.edu and type in your name and see how it characterizes you. What it does is it runs a Google search on your name. And then it does a whole lot of fairly advanced topic modeling to try and figure out sort of what are the things that characterize you. And some of it can be really, really telling, and when you get to watch it, you can sort of see as it goes through the different sites that it comes up with, and it grabs, that first snippet that Google will give you, and you see the different snippets, and you see these different categories coming up and down in importance in its characterization of you. But, it makes a lot of mistakes. One of the first mistakes it makes is like if your name is John Smith, it's a portrait of all the John Smiths in the world, not just you. And, as anyone who's been stopped at the airport because someone read a name like theirs is on the stop list knows, this is a sort of constant issue in this world of data that we live in, that the things that the machine uses to identify you can often be quite wrong, and that this whole sort of mass of data around you depends on what the identifier that it hangs on. So there's a lot of data that may be stuck onto you that's not even really about you. So, but then it's, takes what that data is that it finds. And then we had a whole series of sort of words and categories about people, and it's going to try and figure out which ones of those categories most suit you. And there you get into just the sort of subjectivity of the machine and its algorithms, because some of it is, these algorithms are good, they're not perfect. Some of it, a particular topic model, you train it on a set of words, and the way that we trained it will give it very, very different things, and there's going to be whole sets of words that we didn't think of, or situations where you think, oh, that's a synonym for something else, and it goes off in a completely wrong direction. So what's interesting here are both the very prescient ways that it can characterize you, but also that it's a piece about the mistakes that the machine as artists can make. We're going to skip over this quickly because we have this cake coming up. And I just wanted to sort of leave with this question of how can we use these data portraits to think about our own privacy, because this is work by Nan Golden, who's a photographer whose work I really like, and it's very, very interesting because she does these incredibly intimate photographs of people that are extraordinarily sensitive, and so it's a very, very interesting piece because when you look at her, if you look at her collections of books, she's photographed mostly close friends of hers, so they're almost all people she knows very, very well. They're, some of them are photographed in bed, they're photographed in the bath, but they don't have this very, at least to me, this very voyeuristic quality that, she should not have been there. That there's something that's very hard to put your finger on about the sort of warmth and trust that goes into these photographs that are often of people in very, very, a lot of her friends were drug addicts, so it's, it's people in very, very vulnerable situations, but it's a privacy revealing piece that's not offensive. And so the whole issues around privacy are very, very tricky about what we choose to reveal and what we choose to hide. And so I wanted to sort of end this with this notion of the data portrait as a mirror and how we can use it as a way to sort of sort through all the data about ourselves. And again, so quickly to think about this model of our bodies and how much, even in the last century, we go back and forth between what can be seen and what can be revealed. Between, for instance, just thinking about what most of us would feel comfortable wearing on the beach, but just thinking how uncomfortable you'd be coming into work wearing that. You would be horrified to show up in a bathing suit at work. But it's not that you've never worn a bathing suit, or that you will never wear one, or that indeed you wouldn't even see some of the same people, but our context for where we choose to reveal things change. And the other piece about thinking about this in terms of bodies, and I'll keep this quick because it's a longer metaphor, but is that the notion of how much we reveal or not has very complex relationships with power. Because even if you look at the history of women's clothing, as women became more and more powerful within Western society, their clothing became more and more revealing over time. And it seems at some level that you can make a very easy case as well. When women are in very poor positions in society, the worse their position, the more covered up they are. But it's a much too simple notion to look at it that way. Because if you look again at, for instance, something like corporate clothing, we look at what men wear in a meeting, their suits really cover them up. What you see of men in meetings are their hands, and you see them above their neck. And then if you look at, what secretaries often end up wearing to work. If you see women who are very powerful, they're often wearing much more men's-like clothing, and are very covered up. And the person who's much less powerful is the person, whose legs are showing, who's in a sleeveless dress. Some very, very complicated issues around what does it mean in terms of your power to reveal things, to be powerful enough to reveal something, and to what extent is it a coercive revealing, and to what extent is it voluntary. So it doesn't give us an answer about privacy, but I think it gives us some interesting models of thinking about it in ways that are a little bit more nuanced than we sometimes think about saying privacy is, keeping data private is good, or everything should be open, and of thinking about some of the nuances of privacy and control. And so I'm actually going to leave it at that, because I think we've been talking for a while, but if anyone has any questions, I will be happy to answer them. So thank you.
Possibilities are endless for these data markets. I'm wondering whether there are any online communities or social networking sites where data portraits are in common use. And if not, why not?
Okay, so I was actually leaving this up because this is the last slide, but I will talk about this briefly. This was another student project. It's a site called Microcosm. I think it's still running, I'm not entirely sure. But the idea here was to do something that was like Twitter, but to use graphical imagery instead. And so what people do here is they keep statistics about themselves. How much they've run that day, what they had for breakfast, it can be anything. They have a set of different statistical graphs you can choose. And people do go there, and it works as a community, and it's a little bit Twitter-like, and people update every day, but they just update different statistical graphs, they can comment on each other. So that's one community that does that. In terms of sort of larger scale communities like Facebook or Twitter, I don't think so. I mean, I'm hoping that, in 5 years it would be much more of a norm to see this, but I don't know why not. I think it should be.
Have you looked at all at how people, this is kind of related to my question, how people choose to do, in a sense, portraits of themselves? I kind of alluded earlier to what the kind of information people would put on Facebook or something. But people have blogs, people have their own websites.
Right.
I've got a website where I've got a self-portrait, for example, and it took me a long time to compose it. But have you investigated all the kinds of choices that people make about how to represent themselves when they're going beyond just the basic, here's a picture of my face?
Well,
your research or your
that is a pretty broad thing. To some extent, Facebook is, how do people choose to represent
but
themselves?
Facebook already kind of provides you with context. I'm wondering if, for people who have their own website, for example, they can pretty much choose any form of self-representation, for a portrait, which could include data or could include a picture or whatever. Have you researched that at all, or is that something?
I looked at that more sort of in the early days of the web. I don't think it's a tractable question right now because there's an awful lot that's out there. In terms, and again, part of it is how do people do things within a cultural template. So, it's certainly it was a little more obvious very early on in the web. Like these are what professors' homepages look like. Everyone around said, okay, I'm a professor, and now what do other professors do? And then they all kind of look the same. Or I'm a teenager, So I think a lot of it is you never operate in that kind of complete freedom. It's always sort of how do you signal what your context is and what are the things, and then in sort of what Irving often calls sort of performance of self, some of it is then how virtuoso are you as a performer within that type of thing, or are you trying to stand back from it, do not put that effort in and stuff. But there's certainly now so many ways that people choose. I think also what's interesting about something like Facebook is that looking at the part that's about self-consciously saying, who am I, is really boring. What's my music, what's my taste, what do I like, is not interesting. But what is interesting, I think what's made it succeed where all the other social networking sites fell off is that because they made this, the way they made the status updating work meant that you constantly create this portrait in your conversations with other people. And so I think the interesting self-portrait is the one that's made with some self-consciousness. You are doing this as a performance, and you're putting up the status, you're trying to think, is this going to amuse people, am I going to offend someone? So it's not unself-conscious, but it's not that same kind of telling me about yourself piece. So I think that's one of the more interesting contemporary ones.
I guess what I was more curious about is whether there are sociological or anthropological trends in terms of, people used to, like 5-10 years ago, because in the early days of the internet, it was like, here's a picture of me, here's my family, here are my hobbies.
Right.
And I'm wondering if now, maybe during a recession, people tend to represent themselves more in terms of their professional skills or interests, they tend to represent themselves more, some other thematic.
Right, but I think it's also that not only has the economy changed, but to a large extent the tools have changed.
I see,
So,
so it's too
so
hard
the
to
thing is that
forecast.
people, so people are saying, well, if you want to present myself professionally, I might be doing it on LinkedIn.
I see.
And then, and it may depend, there's people who have very professional websites and things like that, and there's a much more of a vocabulary of what is a website for a particular type of thing. So it's the context is so different.
Well, one of the takeaways I have here is a level of interpretation, and I guess the desire for neutral interpretation. Is you have, in terms of you have a portrait of how do you want to represent yourself. That was what you first showed in terms of paintings and whatnot. You then have how does somebody else want to represent you, being the bag, empty the bag out and whatnot. Then you have, in terms of data, the statistical graph is one where it's not really neutral because it's grabbing things from all over and you don't know. But you mentioned Facebook. One of the things I saw was this aspect where it will take all the words that you placed into your status.
Yes, you tag
so you have control over that.
Right.
And then it makes this graph of all the top words you use. I find that is a little more neutral because you're in control, but you don't remember that you're doing it over this extended period of time.
Right. Yes. So exactly. So I think that's. What I was saying, I thought the status updates were interesting because it's over time. It is a performance. You've chosen to say these things, and then so taking that as the basic data and rendering that is interesting. Or I think the things we did with people's postings are things you choose to say publicly rendered in some compact form. So some of it's how subconscious it is. There's a difference in things I've put out there to be, public things that I've stated, things I might do self-consciously. It's very different than data that's been collected about you without any intention of being a presentation.
Yeah, one practical application is I worked on a large corporate website for an online help system. And it's a real problem when you just don't know the technical level of that anonymous user who comes to your help system. So we try to create a portrait in a sense. And if you have a login, you get a little bit of extra information, but I have no answer because we really didn't know how to do it well besides what they choose to click on.
Right.
But the thought was even how quickly they look at pages or how they scroll or something like that. You could start to build a picture of where you should pitch the information.
Right. So yes, exactly. Because I think there's just a lot of times where there are small nuances that you can read. Like if if that person came in for help in a face-to-face situation, you could tell by the way they speak or when they start to interrupt you or something. They're giving a lot of cues about their level of expertise very quickly. And so some of it is there's a lot of cues that are given off online, but we don't have very good technologies for capturing that. We did a project a while back of doing online poker. Because poker is something where if you play face-to-face, it's really about reading the nuances of the other person. Yes, there's a card game there, but a lot of it's a very psychological game. And I don't know if I ever followed online poker that well, but certainly at the time, none of the online poker ones really dealt with psychology. It became a pure game of cards. And they might have avatars, but they were meaningless. And so what we did was we did a game where there wasn't much of the way of avatars, but it captured all of your movements. And that would be displayed and highlighted for everybody else. So what it would do is you could, for instance, you could look at other people's history of how they played certain things and whether their wins and losses, but it displayed to everyone whose history you were looking at. And it, when you looked at your cards, you would do something to fan it out. You couldn't see that you were what cards they were, obviously, but you could see, okay, now he's looking at his cards. Now he's looking at someone's history. Now he's looking at his chips. So you always had to highlight what you were looking for, and that information got conveyed. You could certainly choose to game it, because if you thought, oh, this makes me look nervous, or I want to look more nervous, but the same way you can game it with online poker. So a lot of it's about being able to convey a lot of the little things that people do that might be meaningful that right now our interface just doesn't pass on because it doesn't think it's interesting. All right, well, thank you all very much.